The January wind screamed through the Colorado peaks, a blade of ice against the world. Down below, a girl ran. She ran for her life. Nika Yoder's plain woolen dress was no match for the cold. It found every seam, every gap, tearing at her skin. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic drum in the frozen silence. She'd heard the words just hours ago, drifting from the parlor. Her father's voice, broken and defeated. "Very well, Mr. Tanner. The marriage will be next month." Then came the other voice, slick with triumph. "Eli Tanner. A smart decision, Yodar. Your debt will be forgotten once I have your daughter." Nika's breath hitched. She was a debt, a piece of property to be traded. So she ran. Through the darkened farmhouse, past the room where her parents slept a sleep she couldn't share. A small cloth bundle was all she had. A loaf of bread, her mother's prayer book, a spare dress. Every creak of the floorboards was a thunderclap in her ears. Outside, frost glittered on the apple trees like a million tiny knives. She had to get away, further than Tanner's money could reach, further than her father's shame could follow. The morning sun was a cold, steel disk in the sky as she pushed higher into the foothills. The snow grew deeper. The pines stood like silent, watching giants. She'd heard stories of these mountains, wild animals, lonely men, but any danger out here was better than the one she'd left behind. Eli Tanner's eyes. She could see them now, cold, calculating. The eyes of a man who measured the worth of everything and everyone. By midday, the trail turned to treachery. Ice hid beneath a dusting of snow. Her horse, Grace, stumbled. One moment they were moving, the next the world was a whirl of white and pain. Grace went down hard. Nika was thrown clear, landing in a deep drift that stole the air from her lungs. When she could finally breathe, she saw Grace standing nearby, favoring a leg. Not broken, thank the Lord, but she couldn't be ridden. Nika sent her childhood friend back down the trail, a sharp pat on the rump and a heart full of tears. She was alone now, truly alone. The afternoon was an endless walk through a world of white. Her boots, meant for the farm, were soaked and heavy. The cold was deep in her bones now. As the sun sank behind the peaks, despair began to creep in. She was going to die out here, free, but dead. Then she saw it, a thin curl of smoke rising against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. Hope, fierce and sudden, surged through her. Where there was smoke, there was fire. Where there was fire, there was life. The cabin seemed to rise out of the darkness. Rough-hewn logs, a sturdy chimney, a single window glowing with warm lamplight. She stood at the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm. Who lived here? A friend or another monster? She forced her frozen feet across the snow and knocked on the heavy pine door. The sound was feeble, lost in the rising wind. But she heard movement inside, a chair scraping back, heavy boot steps crossing a wooden floor. The steps stopped. The world held its breath. Then a latch lifted. The door creaked open. Firelight spilled out, outlining the man who stood there. He was tall, broad-shouldered. His face was a road map of hard living, a long, pale scar tracing a path along his jaw. But it was his eyes that held her, wary, watchful, but not cruel. And as she opened her mouth to speak, the world tilted and darkness took her. She woke to the smell of wood smoke and venison stew. She was lying on a rough pallet near a roaring stone hearth, a heavy wool blanket tucked around her. The man sat in a chair across the small room watching her. The firelight flickered across the scar on his jaw. "You're awake," he said. His voice was deep, rough, like rocks grinding together. "Please," she whispered, her throat raw. "I need shelter, just for the night." He stood up, a towering figure against the dancing flames. He moved to the hearth and ladled steaming stew into a wooden bowl. "You're Amish," he stated. It wasn't a question. "What brings one of the plain folk so deep into my mountains? Alone?" She told him everything, the words tumbling out in a rush. Her father's debt, Eli Tanner's cold eyes, the desperate flight into the storm. When she finished, the only sounds were the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. The man's face was unreadable. I cannot simply take you in, he said finally. His words were a bucket of ice water. It would not be proper. An unmarried woman under my roof. But I'll die out there. Desperation made her voice sharp. There is one way, he said slowly, his gaze intense. My mother, she was a devout woman. She made me swear on her Bible, after my sister, after a tragedy, that I would never allow even the appearance of evil under my roof. To protect a woman's honor and my own. He took a deep breath. I can offer you shelter. I can offer you protection from this man Tanner. But there is a price, not of coin. Nika waited, her heart hammering against her ribs. What could he possibly want? If you are to stay here, he said, his voice as solemn as a prayer, you must marry me. By sunset tomorrow. It is the only way to make it honorable in the eyes of God. She stared at him, the warmth from the fire draining from her body. Marry him? A stranger? A scarred mountain man with shadows in his eyes? It was madness. She had fled one forced marriage only to run straight into another. I don't even know your name, she whispered. Jack Hale, he said, and I don't know yours. But I know what my promise to my mother demands. And I know a storm is coming that will bury this mountain in 10 feet of snow. The choice is yours. Marriage by sunset. Or you take your chances with the storm. The wind shrieked around the cabin, a chorus of screaming demons. She thought of Eli Tanner's possessive glare. She looked at Jack Hale's steady, unyielding eyes. One was a cage of glittering gold. The other was a fortress of rough stone, a fortress with a terrible, unbreakable price of admission. I accept, she whispered, the words tasting like ash in her mouth. Jack nodded once, his expression unchanging. Then rest, he said, turning back to his chair. Tomorrow you will become my wife. Nika lay back, her mind reeling. She listened to the storm raging outside and knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that it was nothing compared to the storm that had just entered her life. The day passed in a blur of tense silence. Jack was outside for hours, splitting wood with a relentless, punishing rhythm. Nika stayed inside, sweeping the floor, tidying his meager belongings, her hands trembling with every gust of wind that rattled the shutters. This was real. This was happening. As the sun began to dip below the snow-laden peaks, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and red, Jack came back inside. He carried not firewood, but an old leather-bound Bible. It's time, he said quietly. He lit a few tallow candles, their small flames pushing back the encroaching shadows. He placed the Bible on the rough wooden table. This was my mother's, he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. It seems right that these words should bind us. He opened the worn book, the pages whispering under his calloused fingers. Come, Ahana said, stand with me. She moved to his side, a puppet pulled by strings of fate. He took her hand. His was rough and warm, a stark contrast to her own, which was cold as ice. These are sacred vows, Nika, he said, his blue eyes meeting hers in the candlelight. They bind us before God, even without a preacher. He read the words, his voice deep and steady. I, Jack Hale, take thee, Nika Yodar, to be my wedded wife. When it was her turn, her own voice was a trembling whisper, barely audible above the crackling fire. I, Nika Yodar, take thee, Jack Hale, to be my wedded husband. Just as she spoke the final words, a sound cut through the howl of the wind, a sound that made her blood run cold. Hoofbeats, many of them, crunching through the snow, getting closer. Jack's head snapped up, his hand still holding hers, tightened like a vice. He moved to the window, peering through a crack in the shutter. It's them, he breathed, his voice a low growl. Tanner's men. But then his body went rigid. And your father? Nika's heart stopped. Her father? Here. A heavy fist hammered on the door. Hale, we know you're in there. Open up. Jack turned from the window, his face a mask of stone. He didn't reach for the rifle hanging above the hearth. He just looked at Nika, a question in his eyes. Her legs felt like water, but she stood her ground. This was her choice. This was her husband. She nodded once, a tiny, defiant gesture. He unlatched the door. The wind and snow swirled in, bringing with it 3 men. 2 were the rough-looking riders she'd expect from a cattle baron, but the third was her father. Abraham Yodar stood there, his face haggard, his eyes avoiding hers. "Father?" she whispered. "Nika, you must come home," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "Mr. Tanner is a forgiving man. He will overlook this foolishness." "She's not going anywhere," Jack said, stepping in front of her. "She's my wife now." Her father's eyes finally met hers, and what she saw in them broke her heart. Not love, not concern, just a desperate, hollow fear. "This isn't just about the debt, Nika," he said, his voice cracking. "Tanner, he knows about the land titles, all of them, for the whole settlement." Nika swayed. The land titles. For generations, her people had worked their farms, believing the land was theirs. But the official paperwork, filed decades ago, had been irregular. A legal gray area that a man with enough money and lawyers could exploit. "He'll ruin us all," her father pleaded. "He'll take everything. Our homes, our farms, everything we built, unless you honor the agreement." The trap wasn't just for her. It was for her entire community. Her freedom was the price of their survival. She looked from her father's terrified face to Jack's unyielding one. She had run from a cage only to find it was 100 times larger than she had ever imagined. Jack's voice cut through the tension in the cabin, low and dangerous. "Get out," he said. He wasn't looking at Nika's father. He was looking at Tanner's men. "This is my property, and she is my wife." One of the riders laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Wife? You call a few mumbled words over a book a marriage? Judge Harrison will laugh you out of his courtroom." "Then let him laugh," Jack said. "But for tonight, you're leaving." He still hadn't moved toward his rifle. He was just a man, standing in a doorway. But there was something in his stance, something in his eyes, that made the 2 hired guns hesitate. They looked to Abraham Yoder, but he just stood there, a broken man. "This changes nothing," the rider sneered. "Tanner will get what he wants. He always does." He spat on the floor of the cabin, then turned and stomped back into the snow. The other rider followed. Her father lingered for a moment. "Nika, please," he whispered. "I am sorry," she said, and the words were like stones in her throat. "But I cannot." He flinched as if she'd struck him. Without another word, he turned and followed the others into the darkness. Jack bolted the door, the heavy wooden bar thudding into place. The silence that fell was heavier than the snow piling up outside. "The land titles," Nika murmured, sinking into a chair. "Is it true?" Jack's face was grim in the firelight. "I've heard whispers that Tanner's been buying up old claims, looking for loopholes. If he's found one—" He didn't need to finish. She was trapped. Either she sacrificed herself, or her entire community would pay the price. Guilt, cold and sharp, pierced her heart. "This is my fault," she whispered. "I've brought this trouble to you, to everyone." "No," Jack said, kneeling in front of her. He took her hands in his. "The trouble was already there. You just brought it into the light." He fell silent for a long moment, studying her face. "You are the bravest woman I have ever met." She shook her head, tears blurring her vision. "I'm not brave. I'm a coward. I ran." "You ran towards something," he corrected gently. "Freedom. Hope. That's not cowardice." They stayed like that, his hands holding hers, the fire popping and hissing. The night outside was deep and silent now. The riders gone. The storm settled into a steady, heavy snowfall. "We will face this," he said, "together." But as Nika looked around the small spare cabin, her new home, she felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter outside. She had found a protector in Jack Hale, a man of quiet strength. But what could one man do against the power and greed of someone like Eli Tanner? What could their firelight vows do against a legal document that could unmake an entire world? The cabin was a tiny island in a sea of snow, and the tide of their troubles was rising. Fast. The next few days were a strange dance of survival and discovery. The snow fell relentlessly, sealing them off from the world, a prison of pristine white. They worked together, a silent, efficient team. Jack taught her how to set snares, how to read the tracks of deer and rabbit in the snow. His hands, though calloused, were surprisingly gentle as he showed her how to bait a trap. Nika, in turn, brought a sense of order to his chaotic cabin. She mended his worn shirts with the tiny, perfect stitches of her people. She baked bread, the warm, yeasty smell filling the small space with a sense of home he hadn't known in years. They spoke little of the threat that hung over them, but it was always there, a shadow in the corner of the room. One afternoon, while looking for extra blankets in a large wooden chest, Nika's fingers brushed against something small and soft, tucked into a corner. It was a dress, a child's dress made of faded calico, with delicate embroidery along the collar. It was lovingly, carefully made, and heartbreakingly small. She was holding it when Jack came back inside, his arms full of firewood. He stopped dead when he saw what was in her hands. The color drained from his face. For a moment, she thought he would be angry, but then a look of such profound sadness crossed his features that it made her own heart ache. "I had a daughter," he said, his voice thick. He stacked the wood by the hearth with shaking hands. "Her name was Lily. She would have been 7 this year." Nika folded the little dress carefully, her hands stroking the soft fabric. She waited, knowing he needed to tell this story in his own time. "Her mother, Sarah, she was my betrothed. We were to be married in the spring, but a fever came through the valley. It took them both within a week of each other." He sank into his chair, staring into the flames. "I made this cabin for them, for us." Now the cradle in the corner, which she had assumed was for a future family, took on a new tragic meaning. It was a monument to a life that had never been. "I'm so sorry, Jack," she whispered. He looked up, his eyes bleak. "That's why I came up here, to get away from it all. I thought I could outrun the ghosts." He ran a hand over the scar on his jaw. "But a man's past has a way of catching up to him." He looked at her then, a new understanding dawning in his eyes. "You're running from ghosts too, aren't you?" She nodded, clutching the small dress to her chest. "I am." In that moment, something shifted between them. They were no longer just two strangers bound by a desperate bargain. They were two wounded souls finding a fragile comfort in each other's presence. They were two people who understood what it meant to lose everything. But later that night, as Nika lay on her pallet, a new and terrible thought took root in her mind. Jack was a good man, an honorable man, a man who had already suffered more loss than anyone should have to bear. And she had brought the world crashing down on him again. Eli Tanner wouldn't just come for her, he would come for Jack. He would try to destroy him, to take this last refuge from him. She had escaped one cage only to trap this grieving man in it with her. The weight of that knowledge was heavier than any snowstorm. One morning, the relentless snowfall finally stopped. The sun emerged, bright and blinding, turning the world into a landscape of glittering diamonds. "The snow's packed enough," Jack announced, his breath pluming in the crisp air. "We should go to town." Nika's heart leaped into her throat. "Town? But Tanner." "We need supplies," Jack said, his jaw set. "And we need to see the preacher. Make this marriage of ours official in the eyes of the law. It's our best defense." The logic was sound, but fear coiled in her stomach. Facing the whispers and stares of the townspeople was a terrifying prospect. But as Jack hitched his mule to a small sled, his movements calm and capable, she knew he was right. They had to face this, not hide from it. The ride down the mountain was breathtakingly beautiful, but Nika could find no joy in it. When they finally crested a rise and the town of Silver Creek spread out below them, her anxiety reached a fever pitch. Jack guided the sled down the main street. Just as she had feared, heads turned. Whispers followed them like a trail of smoke. "That's him, the mountain man. And that's the Amish girl he's keeping." Jack ignored them, pulling the sled to a halt in front of the mercantile. Inside, the storekeeper's eyes widened at the sight of them. While Jack traded a bundle of furs for flour and salt, Nika pretended to examine a bolt of cloth. She could feel the stares of two women by the pickle barrel. "Heard he forced her," one of them whispered, not quietly enough. "Traded shelter for, well, you know. Poor thing." Nika's cheeks burned. She wanted to scream that they were wrong, that Jack was an honorable man, but she kept her silence, her shame a hot coal in her chest. She saw Jack's shoulders stiffen. He had heard them too. For a second, she saw a flicker of the dangerous man he might have been, a glint of steel in his eyes. But then he turned, his face calm, and met her gaze. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod, a silent message of support. Their next stop was the small, clapboard church at the end of the street. A tall man with kind eyes and graying hair met them at the door. "Jack," he said, his voice warm with surprise. "It's been too long." Then his eyes fell on Nika, and a look of concern crossed his face. "Reverend Tully," Jack said, "this is Nika, my wife. We've come to have our union properly blessed." The Reverend ushered them into his small study, the air smelling of old books and beeswax. "I'm glad you came, son," he said, his use of the familiar term making Nika's eyes widen. "But you should know, Eli Tanner was here 2 days ago. He told me a very different story." Jack's face hardened. "Whatever he told you, it was a lie." "He had papers, Jack. A contract signed by the girl's father." Reverend Tully sighed, sinking into his chair. "He has influence. Friends in high places." "We have the truth," Nika said, her voice quiet but firm. "And we have our vows before God." The Reverend studied her for a long moment, his gaze searching. "Tell me your story," and he said. And so they did. When they finished, Reverend Tully sat in silence, his fingers steepled. "I believe you," he said finally, "but belief may not be enough against Tanner's legal power." He leaned forward. "There's something else you need to know. Tanner wasn't just asking about the marriage. He was asking about you, Jack, about your past, about the shooting up at the mines." A cold dread washed over Nika. "What about it?" Jack asked, his voice carefully neutral. Reverend Tully's eyes were full of pity. "He's petitioned the territorial judge to reopen the investigation. He's claiming it wasn't an accident. He's claiming it was murder." The room suddenly felt very small, the walls closing in. This was Tanner's plan. It wasn't just about forcing Nika into marriage. It was about destroying Jack completely, to take his land, his freedom, his very life. And she was the weapon he was using to do it. The ride back up the mountain was a blur of sickening dread. Murder. The word echoed in Nika's mind with every crunch of the sled's runners on the snow. Jack was silent, his profile rigid against the winter landscape, his jaw set like granite. When they finally reached the cabin, he didn't speak, just unhitched the mule and began splitting firewood with a fierce, desperate energy. Nika watched him from the window, his powerful swings of the axe sending chips of wood flying. He wasn't just splitting logs, he was fighting demons. She knew she had to break the silence. She made a pot of strong coffee and took a steaming mug out to him. He stopped, the axe resting on the chopping block, his chest heaving. "It wasn't murder," he said, not looking at her. His voice was raw. "You have to believe me." "I do believe you, Jack," she said softly, setting the mug down. He finally turned to face her, his eyes tortured. "It was an ambush. I was guarding a silver shipment. Tanner's men came out of nowhere. I fired back. A man went down. It was chaos." He traced the scar on his jaw. "I found out later he was just a traveler, caught in the crossfire, a man with a wife and children. The guilt, it's eaten at me for years. It's why I swore off my gun." He sank onto a log, burying his face in his hands. "But now Tanner's twisting it, making me out to be a killer." Nika sat beside him, her shoulder brushing his. "Why would he do this? Why does he hate you so much?" Jack let out a bitter laugh. "It's not about you, Nika. Not really, it never was. It's about this land, this mountain." He looked around at the towering pines, the snow-covered slopes. "My father homesteaded this land. It has one of the richest silver veins in the territory running right under it. Tanner's father tried to buy him out for years. When he couldn't, he tried to cheat him. But my father was a smart man. He made sure his claim was ironclad. After he died," Jack continued, his voice low, "Tanner came after me. He thought I'd be easier to scare off. He engineered the whole thing. The robbery on the silver shipment. It was his men. He wanted me gone. In jail or dead. Either way, the land would have been his for the taking." It all clicked into place. The pieces of a puzzle she hadn't even known she was solving. This wasn't a new conflict. It was an old war. A war for land, for wealth, for power, and she and her family were just the latest pawns in Tanner's cruel game. He hadn't just stumbled upon the loophole in her community's land titles. He had been looking for a weapon to use against them, a way to gain leverage, to control the whole valley. And in her father's desperation, he had found it. So the man who died, she began, he wasn't an innocent traveler? Jack shook his head, a grim light in his eyes. He was one of Tanner's hired guns. I didn't know it then. It took me years to piece it together. But by then, I was already up here, living like a hermit. My reputation was ruined. Who would believe me? He looked at her, his expression a mixture of despair and a dawning, terrible resolve. He's using you to finish what he started. If he can invalidate our marriage and get me sent to prison for murder, he wins. He gets you, he gets my land, and he gets to break your people and take theirs. He gets everything. The sheer scale of Tanner's evil was breathtaking. He wasn't just a cruel man. He was a monster, willing to destroy countless lives to satisfy his greed. And they were standing right in his path. The setting sun cast long, dark shadows across the snow, shadows that looked like grasping claws. That night the cabin felt different. It was no longer a sanctuary. It was a besieged fortress. Every creak of the timbers, every howl of the wind sounded like approaching danger. Sleep was impossible. He'll send the sheriff next, Jack said, staring into the dying embers of the fire. He had brought his rifle inside and it leaned against the wall next to him, a silent, menacing presence. Sheriff Rusk is on his payroll. Everyone knows it. What will we do? Nika whispered. For the first time, Jack's face showed a flicker of uncertainty. I don't know. My vow. I swore I'd never kill again. But if they come for you... He couldn't finish the sentence. The choice he might have to make hung between them, terrible and unspoken. The knock on the door came just after dawn. It wasn't a polite knock. It was the hard, authoritative rap of the law. Jack's eyes met Nika's across the room. He moved to the door, his hand hovering near the rifle, then dropping away. He opened the door. Sheriff Rusk stood on the porch, flanked by two deputies, and his face wore a smug, triumphant smirk. Morning, Hale, he said. Got a warrant for your arrest, for the murder of one Jebediah Stryker. He held out the paper. It looked official. The seal of the territorial court gleamed in the morning sun. And, the sheriff added, his eyes glinting, I have another document here, an order from Judge Harrison. It declares your so-called marriage to Miss Yodar here to be null and void. She is to be placed in my custody and returned to town, pending her legal union with Mr. Tanner. It was happening. It was all happening, just as they'd feared. You can't do this, Jack said, his voice a low growl. I have a right to a trial. Oh, you'll get your trial, Rusk said with a nasty chuckle. After you've spent a few months rotting in the territorial prison. As for the girl, the law's the law. He nodded to his deputies. Take her. One of the deputies started to move past Jack. Without thinking, Jack slammed his shoulder into the man, sending him stumbling back onto the porch. Don't you touch her, he snarled. In an instant, the deputies had their guns drawn and pointed at Jack's chest. Don't be a fool, Hale, Rusk warned. You're already facing a murder charge. Don't add resisting arrest and assaulting an officer. Nika screamed, her hands flying to her mouth. This was it. This was how it ended. In a flash of violence and blood on the snow. But then a new voice cut through the standoff. A strong, clear voice from the edge of the clearing. That's far enough, Sheriff. They all turned. Reverend Tully stood there, a shotgun held loosely in the crook of his arm. And he wasn't alone. Standing with him were a dozen men from the town, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants. They were armed with hunting rifles and shotguns, their faces grim and determined. Sheriff Rusk's jaw dropped. What is the meaning of this, Reverend? This is official business. It looks more like a kidnapping to me, Reverend Tully said, his voice calm but carrying the weight of absolute authority. We had a town meeting last night after Jack and Nika left. We've had enough of Eli Tanner and his bought and paid for justice. We won't let you take this man without a proper hearing in front of the whole town, and we sure as hell won't let you lay a hand on this woman. The deputies looked nervously from the townsfolk to the sheriff. Their bravado was gone, replaced by the uncertainty of men suddenly facing very bad odds. Rusk's face was purple with rage. "This is an insurrection. I'll have you all arrested." "You and what army, Sheriff?" the blacksmith called out. "Looks to us like your army just consists of two boys who are about to have a real bad day if they don't put those guns away." Slowly, reluctantly, the deputies lowered their pistols. The standoff was over. For now. Jack pulled Nika back inside the cabin, his arm a band of steel around her. He was shaking, not with fear, but with a flood of adrenaline and disbelief. The town. The town had stood up for them. They weren't alone after all. The sheriff and his deputies retreated, their threats and curses swallowed by the vast snowy wilderness. The men from the town stayed for a while, their presence a silent promise of protection, before heading back down the mountain, leaving a few sentries posted in the trees just in case. Reverend Tully stayed behind. He came inside the cabin, leaning his shotgun by the door. "You have friends, Jack," he said, his kind eyes resting on his nephew. "More than you know." "I don't understand," Jack said, still stunned. "Why?" "Because people are tired of being bullied by men like Tanner," the Reverend explained. "And because they saw the truth in you two yesterday. They saw a man trying to protect his wife, and a woman speaking from the heart. That's more powerful than any legal document Tanner can buy." He looked at Nika with a warm smile. "Your courage has inspired them, my dear." A wave of gratitude so strong it made her dizzy washed over Nika. These people who had whispered about her and judged her had seen past their prejudice and stood up for what was right. "But this isn't over," Jack said grimly. "Tanner won't give up." "No, he won't," the Reverend agreed, "which is why we need a plan. He'll go to the territorial governor. He'll bring in marshals. We've bought you some time, but that's all." He looked around the cabin, his gaze thoughtful. "Your father built this place to be a fortress, Jack. Did he ever show you all its secrets?" Jack's eyes widened in understanding. "The tunnel," he breathed. He led them to the stone hearth. Prying up one of the heavy flagstones at the side revealed a dark, narrow opening. "My great-grandfather dug it during the Ute Wars," Jack explained. "It leads out to a box canyon about a half-mile from here." The existence of the tunnel changed everything. They weren't trapped. They had a way out, an escape route if the worst came to pass. But running felt like a defeat. "We can't just run," Nika said. "If we do, Tanner still wins. He gets the land. He ruins my people." "She's right," Jack said. "We have to fight him, but not with guns." He looked at his uncle. "You're a man of God and a man of books. There has to be something, some piece of evidence, something in the old records that can prove what Tanner's family did." Reverend Tully's eyes lit up. "The church records," he said, a new excitement in his voice. "The original territorial charters and land grants are all stored in the church archives. Tanner's father was a deacon for years. He had access to everything." A desperate plan began to form. The Reverend would go back to town and search the archives, looking for any proof of the Tanner's fraud. Jack and Nika would stay put, guarded by the townspeople, ready to use the tunnel if necessary. It was a long shot, a prayer against a hurricane, but it was hope. As his uncle prepared to leave, he placed a hand on Jack's shoulder. "I was wrong about you, son. I thought you had let the violence of your past consume you, but I see now that you have found a better strength." He smiled at Nika. "Thanks to this one." After he was gone, a fragile sense of optimism filled the cabin. They had allies. They had a plan. They had a secret weapon in the tunnel beneath their feet. But as night fell, a new and more insidious fear began to creep into Nika's heart. What if the Reverend found nothing? What if Tanner returned with federal marshals before he had the chance? The weight of her community's fate still rested on her shoulders, and she knew, with a chilling certainty, that Eli Tanner had not yet played his final, most cruel card. 3 days passed. 3 days of agonizing waiting. The men from town kept their vigil, a rotating watch that ensured the cabin was never unguarded. Every sound, every shadow sent a jolt of fear through Nika. On the fourth morning, they saw a rider approaching. Not the sheriff. It was one of the younger farmers from the town, and he was riding hard. He reined his horse in at the edge of the clearing, his face pale and grim. "It's Tanner!" he shouted. "He's coming! He's got a dozen armed men with him, and he's got your sister!" Nika's blood ran cold. Her sister, her sweet, innocent 14-year-old sister, Sarah. The world tilted on its axis. "He rode into the settlement last night and took her," the farmer gasped, his horse dancing nervously. "He's using her as a hostage. He says he'll trade her for Nika." This was it, the final unthinkable move. Tanner had bypassed the law, bypassed the town's resistance, and gone straight for her heart. The farmer spurred his horse and galloped away to warn the other lookouts. Jack pulled Nika inside, his face a thunderous mask of rage. "I'll kill him," he growled, his hand going for the rifle. This time he meant it. His vow, his promise, everything was forgotten in the face of this monstrous act. "No!" Nika cried, grabbing his arm. "Jack, no! That's what he wants. He wants you to become the killer he claims you are. If you do that, we lose everything." "What else can we do?" he roared, his anguish echoing in the small cabin. "He has your sister." We give him what he wants," she said, the words tearing her apart. "I'll go to him." "Absolutely not," Jack said, his grip on her shoulders fierce. "I will not let you sacrifice yourself." "It's not a sacrifice," she said, her mind racing, a desperate, wild plan forming. "It's a trade, but we do it on our terms." She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "You have to trust me, Jack. We have to fight this his way, with deception, not with guns." The sound of approaching horses grew louder. They were almost there. There was no more time to argue. "There's a hymn my mother taught us," she said quickly, her words a torrent. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." If you hear me sing the line about the fortress, you'll know the plan is working. It's the signal. "A signal for what?" he demanded. "For you to do nothing," she said. "For you to trust in God and in our friends." She kissed him then, a quick, desperate press of her lips against his. "I love you, Jack Hale," she whispered. Then she turned and walked to the door, her back straight, her head held high. She opened the door and stepped out onto the porch, alone, to face the monster who held her sister's life in his hands. Eli Tanner sat on his horse in the center of the clearing, a cruel smile on his face. Beside him, one of his men held Sarah, her eyes wide with terror. "I knew you'd be sensible," Tanner called out. "A fair trade, your sister for yourself. Come now." Nika took a deep breath. She could feel Jack's presence behind her in the doorway, a burning fire of rage held in check only by her plea. She started to walk down the steps, into the snow, toward Tanner. And as she walked, she began to sing. Her voice, clear and pure, rose into the cold mountain air. "The Lord is my rock, my fortress, and my deliverer." It was the signal. She could only pray that Jack and everyone else would understand. Tanner's smile widened as Nika walked toward him, her song a strange, haunting melody in the silent clearing. He saw it as a song of surrender. He was wrong. It was a battle cry. As Nika reached the bottom of the steps, she kept singing, her voice growing stronger with each word. Behind Tanner, on the wooded slope surrounding the cabin, shadows began to move. Not just the dozen men the young farmer had seen, but dozens more. Men from the town, men from her own Amish community, who had set aside their pacifist principles to save one of their own. They rose from the snow, a silent, implacable army armed with hunting rifles and righteous fury. Tanner's men, who had been relaxed and arrogant moments before, suddenly found themselves surrounded, a gun barrel pointed at them from behind every tree. Tanner's face went from triumph to disbelief to pure panicked rage. "What is this?" he screamed. "It's called community, Mr. Tanner," a voice boomed from the porch. Reverend Tully had appeared, his shotgun held at the ready. "Something you wouldn't understand." The man holding Sarah was so startled that his grip loosened. In that instant, Sarah twisted away, scrambling through the snow toward the safety of the cabin. It was over. Tanner was trapped. "You can't do this," he shrieked. "I have the law on my side." "We have a different kind of law up here, Tanner," the blacksmith said, stepping out from behind a large pine, his hammer held in his hand like a weapon. The law of decency. At that moment, another figure emerged from the cabin. It was Nika's father. His face was filled with a shame so deep it was painful to see, but also with a new resolve. He walked directly to Tanner. "The debt is void," he said, his voice shaking but strong. "Your claim on my daughter, on our land, it's all based on lies." From his pocket, he pulled a small, worn, leather-bound book. "Reverend Tully found this in the church archives," he announced, his voice carrying across the clearing. "It's the original church ledger from 50 years ago. It details every land transaction, every agreement, and it proves that your father, Tanner, forged the documents to cheat Jack's family out of their silver claim and to create the fraudulent debts against my people." The proof. It was real. The Reverend had found it. The foundation of Tanner's entire empire was built on a crime. He was ruined. The sheriff's deputies, who had been part of Tanner's posse, threw down their guns in disgust. They weren't going to jail for him. Eli Tanner, his face a mask of insane fury, yanked his pistol from its holster. He wasn't aiming at Jack. He was aiming at Nika. But before he could fire, a blur of motion came from the porch. Jack moved faster than Nika had ever seen him move. He didn't draw his own gun. He launched himself off the porch, tackling Tanner and sending them both tumbling into a snowdrift. The pistol went flying. Jack stood over his vanquished enemy, his chest heaving, his fists clenched. He had done it. He had faced the monster, and he had won, without breaking his vow. He had won with faith, with community, and with the courage of the woman he loved. The aftermath was swift, with the ledger as irrefutable proof. Eli Tanner's empire crumbled. He was taken away by the very territorial marshals he had hoped to use against Jack, facing charges of fraud, conspiracy, kidnapping, and attempted murder. Sheriff Rusk was run out of the territory, his reputation destroyed. Nika's family and her community were freed from their debts, their land secure once and for all. Jack's name was cleared, the old murder charge exposed as the malicious fabrication it had always been. A few weeks later, when the first signs of spring were beginning to touch the mountains, the entire town of Silver Creek, along with Nika's family and community, gathered in the small clapboard church. Nika walked down the aisle on her father's arm. He was a changed man, humbled and grateful, his eyes filled with love and pride for the daughter whose courage had saved them all. She wore a simple white dress, sewn by the women of the town, a gift of friendship and respect. At the altar, Jack was waiting for her. He looked taller, stronger, the old shadows gone from his eyes, replaced by a deep and abiding love. They spoke their vows again, not in the desperate haste of a firelit cabin, but with the joyful certainty of two people who had faced the worst and found their salvation in each other. Their voices rang through the church, a testament to the power of faith and the strength of a love forged in the heart of a winter storm. That evening, back at their cabin, a celebration feast was laid out on long tables under the stars. Laughter and music filled the air. But later, after everyone had gone, Jack and Nika stood alone on their porch, the quiet of the mountain settling around them. Inside, the fire crackled. Jack's rifle still rested on the mantel, but it no longer seemed a threat. It was just a piece of his past. Beside it, Nika had placed her prayer bonnet, a symbol of her own past. Two different worlds, two different lives now joined as one. "I never thought I could be this happy," Jack said, his arm wrapping around her. "I thought this mountain was my refuge from the world, but it was just a lonely place until you came." Nika leaned her head against his shoulder. "God works in mysterious ways," she whispered. "He led me through a storm to bring me home." The stars blazed in the clear night sky, brighter than she had ever seen them. The cradle Jack had built sat by the fire, no longer a monument to loss, but a promise of the future, their future. They had found their peace, not by running from the world, but by standing together with courage and facing it head on. Thank you for listening. Stories like this remind us that even in the coldest winter, hope can find a way to bloom. If this story warmed your heart, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button. I share new stories every day, and I'd love to share the next one with you.